Welcome to the Sacramentalists, a podcast where the ancient Christian faith is brought to bear on issues prevalent in modern culture. We're your hosts. I'm Father Hayden Butler.
And I'm Father Wesley Walker.
And today we have the privilege of a conversation with a friend and mentor of mine, Dr. John Mark Reynolds. And before we jump into our conversation today, I have to confess to our listeners that it's kind of difficult for me to even know how to properly introduce Dr. Reynolds for two reasons. One is mainly because his personal accomplishments are uh, expansive and his CV lengthy. But just to highlight a few of the kind of main points of where he's coming from today, Dr. Reynolds is a trained philosopher holding a PhD in philosophy from the University of Rochester, where he studied Plato under the late and very great Dr. Al Geyer. He is the founding director of the Torrey Honors College at Biola University, my alma mater. He is the founder of the Honors College at Houston Christian University while he was the provost there. And he is the founder and president of the Saint Constantine School and College in Houston, Texas. And the second reason it's difficult to know how to fully express our gratitude for Dr. Reynolds being here today is because he has been such a personal mentor and friend to me. By God's grace, he was really the founder and director of my intellectual wonder from age 16 onward. And he was the reason I attended the Torrey College, and he has been a true friend to me in many seasons of life. Welcome, Dr. Reynolds.
It's really great to be here. I cannot live up to that introduction, so I will just, as my dad used to say to people, make yourself homely. I shall make myself homely. I will make myself at home and just be myself. I should say, lest HCU call me and report me. The Honors College existed when I got there. I helped reboot it with some new leadership, but I did start the cinema and new media arts program in apologetics while I was there. And of course, did you know Josh Sikora when you were in school?
I did.
Yeah, bring Josh Sikora out to become the founding director of cinema and new media arts there. So it's a small world, as they say. And of course, Gary Hartenberg came out and agreed to become the director of a newly revived honors college, which looks startlingly like Torrey. Robert Thomas Lizzo, if anyone was involved in the Torrey program who's listening, knows he's out working for what was Houston Baptist and now Houston Christian University. So
Dr. Lizzo was my mentor in Torrey, and so I have great fortune of that.
Really, really wonderful guy. I will see him and send your greetings.
Please do.
Probably no one is actually interested in my CV. So I once thought I could hide the secret of where the last Russian czar, put the Tsarist gold in the middle of it, and no one would ever find it as a result, because introductions are what they are. So what are you guys thinking about today?
So today we would like to get around to talking about the Saint Constantine project and the idea of the idea behind it. I thought, as well, since we have you here and you're among the many things you like to think about. You like to think about why Christians ought to read Plato. We'd start there actually today as our sort of opening question. So I'd like to start by just asking about something I had recently been exposed to. I can't remember if it was in an article. It evades me, but it was the suggestion that there was in the academy a kind of rule of life being observed there. We often hear about the ideas of Plato's academy, but we don't often hear about the rhythm of life that sort of by which the academy operated. So I was wondering, maybe we could start there, because I think that's going to come to bear on our conversation about Saint Constantine. So first of all, could you, as a Christian who has thought deeply and read deeply into Plato, and Plato being one of those people that sometimes Christians are a little bit allergic to, and for reasons they can't quite articulate. Would you help us by giving us a sense of, you're, as someone who's read Plato for a long time, why is Plato important to read for Christians? And also, could you comment on how Plato kind of gives us a sense of why a structured life, a well-structured life in community is important for the project of learning?
Yeah, Plato is often blamed for a lot because he's in the basement of almost every philosophical idea as one of the fathers of philosophy as we know it. So it is a joke to say that philosophy is a footnote to Plato. It's not quite true. But Plato began to ask all the big questions and provide, I think, some tentative answers. But he also set up the whole notion of dialogue as central to the educational process, that the quest, wondering about things, is central to what education is, and education inside of a community. If anyone listening to this podcast had a good undergraduate college experience educationally, it almost surely took place inside of a tight community. You can go to a giant university, but there are probably 3 or 4 professors who really shaped you, that you got to know well. Or there are a couple of classes, maybe a series of classes inside of an honors college or inside of your major that really transformed you and put you on a path that may still be going on in your life. Think of Plato as being like that to philosophy. He's the person who sent philosophy, the love of wisdom, not the academic discipline, on a particular path, and really created, in some ways, the modern university. He didn't create it in the sense it would be recognizable to us today, but drawing a small community around himself and asking every important question he could think of, whether it's what we would call science today, whether it's what we would call metaphysics or physics, every area, every discipline, he would ask questions. And of course, his most famous student, Aristotle, took those questions in different directions, not as different, I think, as people want them to be sometimes, but took the discussion in different directions. And even the tension then between Plato and Aristotle began to set up, how do we know what we know? How do we find new knowledge? How do we add to the sum of human experience other than just trial and error? How does philosophy, this love of wisdom broadly construed, produce modern science, the Industrial Revolution, eventually thinking about government, Republican and democratic forms of government? This all comes out of Plato. That's why I think Plato gets blamed for a lot, because he's responsible for a lot. It's a little bit like Constantine. Constantine is in one way less important in history, but Constantine made decisions that mark a break in history, that really vital break. And he sent the trajectory of the faith in a different direction, I think, by God's grace. Think of this. We're coming up to the anniversary, a significant anniversary of the First Council of Nicaea. And there is no traditional Christian. There is no Christian that I would recognize as a Christian who doesn't accept the formulation of the faith found at Nicaea. That they may believe more things, they may, add a clause to it, but the basic formulation that began with Constantine at a council he called and paid for, really pivotal to history. So if you don't like what that moment did, if you would like the church to have gone in a different direction, Constantine can become a devil word. He gets blamed for everything. Certain kind of atheist will claim he wrote the Bible. If you go online, he becomes a nonsensical figure. And in the same way, I think for badly read Christians, Plato gets blamed for any idea they happen not to like. Like Plato hates the human body. You can certainly, there's some Platonists that would derive that from Plato, but there are some Platonists who derive almost anything from Plato because he was such a formative figure. It's really useful in the modern world to talk about Platonisms and the many schools of thought that he inspired. He inspired schools of thought that were absolutely cynical about finding any knowledge. The notion that you could find knowledge at all was crazy. You could only have tentative opinions. So Plato is such a master, and he's so early in time that I think we should read him, even if you're going to disagree with everything you think he says, because he's probably like one of those horror movies lurking in the basement of your house, your intellectual house. And if all you need to do is go kill him because he's terrible and he should be expunged or exorcised from your thinking, then you have to know what he actually said to recognize when what you think is biblical. For example, I'm a Christian person. I want to have a biblical imagination, a scriptural imagination. I want to be in line with the teachings of the early church and then the church fathers. As an Orthodox Christian, the conciliar church. I don't want to, just be controlled by Plato. I want to have a Christian imagination. But on the other hand, either through the Neo-Platonists who helped translate the Septuagint, and so we're given a vocabulary, a helpful vocabulary by Plato to do that. And so the New Testament, the Old Testament, used by the early church, heavily influenced by kind of Platonically influenced scholars, to things like the book of Hebrews, where you can go back and forth. Is it using Platonic language? Is it not using Platonic language? I have really good theology friends on both sides of that issue. But notice the language is so much like Plato, and Plato was so influential in the intellectual world of the New Testament era that it's a question we have to ask. When you start talking about shadows and we see dimly, boy, that sounds a lot like something Plato said. And boy, we don't even know the writer of Hebrews. So that's a question we have to ask and talk about. So being totally ignorant of Plato, I think, makes you not very well educated, because he's at the roots of modern science. He's at the roots of most of our modern discussions, for good and bad sometimes.
There's, when with the various Platonisms that you made reference to there, that seems to be where a lot of people get hung up. Is there's a kind of Platonism they don't like, then there's another kind of Platonism. It's sometimes even the case that they'll use a kind of Platonism to talk about the Platonism they don't like, and so, but also with standing out within all that is the formation of the kind of the character of the philosopher. There was Plato who asked good questions about everything, and so it sort of undermines what I think is often the caricature of kind of contemporary philosophy, which is we're over here in the secret philosopher club and we only ask questions that secret philosopher clubs ask. And Plato, is this person who, it reminds me of there's this Anglican priest, Martin Thornton, who said that like the Christian life is not some like sequestered, partitioned life over here, but really it's all of life as experienced by the Christian. And that's
right.
how we have to understand it. And it seems like with Plato, that's his philosophical method, is it's all of life experienced by the lover of wisdom. And what does life look like if the lover of wisdom is becoming constantly a better lover of wisdom? How does he experience life, and how does he go about the world, and what relationship does he cultivate with it? Is that accurate?
I think that's right. And I think most people who would listen to a podcast like this are so deeply influenced by what I will call basic Plato that they don't even know it anymore. So here's one way of living your life. You could live your life just based on what you've received. So, and it's not a horrible way of living your life. Some people lack a kind of curiosity. And I'm often told we want everybody to think for themselves. And there are a fair number of people that I think shouldn't think for themselves because they think so badly. And they also, I don't know why this is true, some people aren't that intellectually curious. So going to church and doing what Father, Joseph tells them to do is actually excellent. Father Joseph would be well educated, he would be well trained, and they're buying into an ancient set of disciplines inside of, for example, my own Orthodox church. That way, they're not going to make goofy mistakes. Now, I agree with Plato that unexamined life is not a great life to live. That very few people, I think, honestly, don't have real questions and can just live with the received wisdom. I actually agree with the received wisdom of the Orthodox Church, but the Orthodox Church doesn't just teach me that I should, stop thinking, not examine, just believe things because I'm told to, because I'm not the kind of personality that works for. And I think there aren't very many people that have been properly raised that are going to end up having the kind of personality that works for. There are some humans that for mental capacity and other things, they can't make decisions for themselves. We don't give them agency, and that's good. We have to do that. But I think for most people that become adults, asking questions at the level you can ask questions is something you have to do. And you have to have satisfactory answers to those questions best you can. And for all of us, that's going to be a little different. I have had friends in philosophy who are Christians who really don't struggle with believing in God. I actually am one of them. I look at human consciousness and the existence of numbers. That's the sense where I'm a Platonist. I think numbers actually exist, like most mathematicians, by the way. Most people who study math for a living think of discovering things in mathematics, not inventing them. And so if I have immaterial objects like numbers, and I have consciousness that can't be explained or reduced to a brain or to my body, and I don't think it can be, then believing in God turned out to be not so hard for me. I didn't sit and, does God exist? How can I believe God exists? But other questions about the truth of Christianity or what form of Christianity I should be part of were very difficult for me. And I had to think about them very hard and as hard as I could and come up with answers that were the best I could find. I also have to live with the fact, and this is very Platonic, that questioning is never going to come to an end. And that eventually, as a human being, I have to commit myself to a particular point of view and live it out the best I can while still having questions. Well, I find that wonderful. If you're kind of the person that thinks all questions are doubt and toxic in the toxic sense, I can't do anything, I can't go anywhere. I like knowing that I don't know everything and looking up at a starry night sky with my astronomically informed friends or my poetic friends. I have both kinds, sometimes the same person, and learning something about the stars from either one of them. It doesn't make me sad that I don't know everything there is to know about the stars, and I'll always have to keep wondering about them given my education and background. In the same way, I don't think it should make people super sad that though we have reasons to think the problem of evil in the universe can have a good solution, that there is, in the goodness of God, a final end to evil and some sense to be made of it. I don't think I have a perfect answer for that. I'm still thinking about it. And when I see bad things in the world, when I see bad things happen to good people, like my students, Hayden, over time, Father, we have learned together and ups and downs have occurred. And when those ups and downs occur to people you love, answers aren't great, right, at the moment, but you keep walking along and wondering. And that's the way Plato suggested we have to live. And I think biblically that fits very neatly with what I think of as biblical or Christian faith. Christian faith, not believing something irrationally, but realizing you're going to get to the point where you've thought about it the best you can, you're not sure you're right, but you make the best choice that you can based on best reason and best experience. And I think that's a sort of basic Platonism as I see him.
Dr. Reynolds, I had a quick question to kind of follow.
I will not have a quick answer, which is probably
that's
to
good.
your sorrow.
No, that's why we have you on, so that you can do the talking. So based kind of on what you're talking about, the received wisdom, but not an unquestioning reception of that tradition. I'm curious in the classroom.
Let me pause you. I want to make sure I said this carefully. I think you have to live that way because you start as a child.
Right.
Like there's no one that doesn't live that way. And a child that too quickly, kicks against the goads of the parents is going to end up electrocuted or something. I just had my first two grandchildren. They're two, and I love this very loving relationship with one of them that we nicknamed Whim Wham, because sometimes she's whimmish and sometimes she's whammish. And if we let her wham too much, she's going to harm herself. So we all live by received wisdom and authority because we all begin as children. And as childhood ends, we leave merely accepting received wisdom and begin to think for ourselves. Everyone does this, I think. And we do it badly sometimes. And it turns out, given what my parents taught me, that I didn't change that much from the way I grew up. And some people do. I'm sorry, I interrupted your question. But I wanted to make sure that what I was saying, I started by saying, I think there are people that just should stick to received wisdom because they don't think well. And I do think those people exist. But I also wanted to point out, and didn't, that we all start that way.
Yeah, absolutely. And in some ways that preempts the question a little bit. But I'm curious in the context of a classroom. So when you're first introducing your students to Plato, what grade did they first read Plato at Saint Constantine?
Seventh grade, and I know that's quite controversial even inside classical education. Some people think you shouldn't read Plato till you go to college, and they have a very different view. if you think about it, what we call classical education today is not classical education. It's more like a great text education, because classical education doesn't really fit the American model of education very well. Unless you're extraordinarily wealthy, you're unlikely to be able to do that and live in the world as it is. So I'd like to imagine that I was born in Ulster in 1890, and that my dad could have sent me to study with the great Knock, and then go to Oxford and do a true classical education in the old sense. But that's not even the main way Oxford educates anymore. The methodology of the tutorial, of asking questions about great books that isn't so classically language centered, is really the way we do things. So I think you can start Plato right away and begin the sense of wonder and dialectic that he gives us.
So I've heard it said that for a student who's first introduced to Plato, at least the one thinker I read on this said that you shouldn't really allow the students to disagree with the text. And so it kind of plays into the dynamics that we were talking about earlier. On the one hand, I mean, certainly a seventh grader, an eighth grader may have a kind of cavalier disagreement that stems from a kind of arrogance,
Right.
not recognizing the greatness of this text and this thinker who's endured for so long. On the other hand, sort of unquestioning agreement or the squelching of questioning seems to be not very Socratic to me. So I'm curious
Yeah.
how you would kind of recommend handling that with students, especially students that young.
So
You know.
yeah, when kids are little, when they're little kids, you're mostly info dumping the kid. But even then, you don't want to squelch their sense of wonder or question asking. I mean, you wouldn't go to a kid who says, "Why is this bug green?" Give them a simple answer they could understand. They keep asking questions. Eventually, I would say, you'd say, well, you're not going to be able to understand the answer. You've now reached your capacity, but keep asking that question. There's an answer out there for you. So I never understand the approach to a text that says, don't question the text. I, I also don't understand it when people say there are no bad questions, because people can ask questions in bad faith. So you
Yeah.
got a student, they don't want to read a hard book. The book is not exciting to them. They don't want to do the work. And so they ask foolish questions to just delay things, the why, what, or they attack the book. And it's in bad faith. But, attacking Plato, if it's done in good faith, Plato would encourage. And so when do you want a kid to do that? I think the minute a kid can do that, because you're trying to guide them to ask better and better questions so they can outgrow you. There's not one topic on anything that I don't have a former student who knows more about it than I do, which is ideal, correct? That's what you would hope would be true. I mean, there may be some pieces of Plato that I know more about than anyone I've taught, because you get to something very, very, very specialized, like Plato's view of the human soul in Timaeus. Who knows? Maybe I do. But that gets really specialized. And so with students, you always want to encourage this sense of wonder. I do not think a great books school that tell people what the book means, like here's what the Iliad means, that I view that as very useless. Now, if a student asks me, what do you think this means? I will tell them, but I don't want to encourage them to think on a complex book like the Iliad, this is Homer, as opposed to Plato, that I've come to the last word on it. Or simply knowing facts about Homer, boy, that's why we should read this book. As far as I can tell, no one should read Plato to kind of, unless they're a specialist, and we need few of those, to memorize all the names or memorize the particular arguments. It's the experience of the text in a community that Plato would be encouraging. So if we're reading something like Charles Dickens in a community, okay, you know all the facts about Great Expectations, but that's anything you can do with Google, you shouldn't think of as education. So it is true that you can actually, AI now is very accurate. For example, in my view of Plato and the human soul, it's getting so good at breaking things down. But that's not interesting, like our discussing whether my view of Plato's view of the human soul is right. You and I in a community, because we're growing together. So even if somebody got Grok or some AI that's cutting edge to give them accurate information about, let's say, a view of Plato, mine, okay, we haven't even started learning yet. We're not learning until we have sincere questions and we dialogue about the answers. Could you dialogue with Grok? A kind of faux dialogue, it seems like to me.
No. So this raises a very important question about the communal aspect of this, which is, again, what provoked me in the thought that I think it was actually a local, maybe down in Lafayette. It was Father Stephen DeYoung. I think I was listening to a podcast where he was talking about the sort of the rhythm of life of the academy.
Yeah.
And this seems to be like maybe a secondary or sadly even a tertiary question in a lot of classical or great works schools, which is, are we building the kind of, I guess, communal rule of life or culture that supports this kind of learning? And so could you help us understand a little bit what was, the kind of rule of life at the academy, and why is rule of life in a school important?
Well, I mean, we can't be sure. And the academy went through many, many phases, like different levels, what was being taught there, what the view of Plato and what he had to say, what was going on there. So I wouldn't want to take, 1,000 years of history and compress it, except to say this: it really created the notion that you went someplace, hung out with people with similar interests, and a master or teacher would guide you into intellectual discovery so that you weren't starting on square zero. I mean, there's the other notion about classical education is that somehow we want to go back to first principles and we don't know anything. No, of course, a classical school is guiding a student towards a world in which we have contact lenses, but also crime. And so thinking about how did we get contact lenses? How do we stop crime? How do we become better people ourselves? I had a bad start to my life, my adult life. How can I become a better person? I'm talking about myself. And philosophy and education, in part, is supposed to help guide us to that better place where we can become a whole soul, a better person, grow into mature Christian adulthood, to use a catchphrase. So that's something we do together, and we can't do it apart. You can't, in that sense, be educated in the Platonic or academic, the academy sense, by yourself. We can't even, I think, legitimately have a real educational experience on this podcast.
Right.
Because it matters. I don't know, did I have a cuckoo clock when you had class with me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I still have the same cuckoo clock in here. And periodically it may have already gone off and you've heard it. I think it matters. I think it matters that you're in 3 dimensions. And if you were here, the cuckoo clock would go off. It matters that I'm a certain age and not another age. So if I had a filter that made me look younger, for example, or older, or like a cat, this would somehow introduce a lack of reality. But we're on Zoom, so we know that there already is a lack of reality.
Right.
I don't know if you have the touch-up feature on Zoom, but we're not 2-dimensional, right? So even if we're getting a high-definition picture of the way the person is, it's not the person, and we're embodied people. And so it's funny that the academy would be this way and need to be this way, because sometimes Plato gets accused of being anti the human body. And there were certainly Neo-Platonists who took him to believe that. If you read his dialogue Phaedo on the death of Socrates, it really sounds like, man, bodies are terrible. They're like tombs. We should get out of them to the real world of the forms. And if you think about the context, that makes sense, because the pivotal thing that motivated Plato in his life, his young life, was the death of his master, whom he portrays as the great questioner, who sends him on this quest, who is murdered by the city of Athens for daring to question the horrific educational system, the horrific evils of Athens. And so one way of wondering, people will say to me, if so many Platonisms could come out of Plato, why didn't he write more clearly? And evidently in the academy, when he was talking to people, we don't know what he said. Of course, we weren't there. He would be very clear, but his dialogues are themselves unclear, if only so that Athens not kill him. As he teaches things, he had a bad experience with democracy and people deciding to kill people who made them think uncomfortable thoughts. So by writing obliquely, he did two things. First, he forced you to come and physically listen to his teaching, which was a little safer. It's very practical. But second, he forced you to dialogue with the text itself. The danger of books, he points out at the end of Phaedrus, is that anyone can pick them up and immediately gain knowledge, even knowledge that's dangerous to them. That's the problem of being a teacher. Not everyone turns out well like you, Father Hayden. Some people don't. They misuse the knowledge that they have, the gifts that they have. And so how do we avoid that as much as possible? By forcing dialogue where you're not even sure what Plato, the teacher, is teaching, so that you're constantly dialoguing with the text, so that being dead, Plato knew he was going to die, he's still dialoguing with you from the text because it's not totally clear. By the way, that's the way I think you should read Aristotle. So many people either find Aristotle more interesting because they think they know exactly what he's saying from these lecture notes that are mostly what we have, or they find him boring because they know exactly what he's saying. Instead of entering into a dialogue, even if we have his opinions, even if we know what he thought about a topic, he's, I think, as a student of Plato, introducing us to a dialogue about it. This is why I think sometimes with Aristotle, people will say, well, we have all of Plato. We have all of Plato's dialogues. It's really unusual in the ancient world. As a result, we sometimes can see that the Aristotle we have is misquoting Plato or being very uncharitable to the master. Like, what are you doing, man? Like, we can see that Plato probably didn't think what you're saying he thought, or it could be interpreted better than you're interpreting him. You're setting up a straw man. And I think that's because even with Aristotle, we should read that and say that very thing and then enter into dialogue. He's forcing us, if we're Platonists, to defend our point of view by sort of throwing up a softball, letting us hit it. And then we keep following his argument and we discover that our hit wasn't as far as we thought it was, that there's more work we have to do. So yeah. I don't get not finding that wonderful. I get people not wanting to do it with Plato. Like, you learn to do it a little bit with Plato. And I'll sometimes, Hayden, I'm sorry, Father Hayden, I'll get used to this, run into a former student who will be embarrassed because they haven't read Plato or Homer since college. And really the question I ask them is, well, what are you reading?
Right.
There is no substitute for reading, as far as I can tell, for a certain kind of mental activity. What are you reading that's long form? You know, it's longer than an Atlantic article that you can read on your phone. What are you reading, and are you asking questions about it? Are you still thinking? Are you still thinking at a high enough level that you could still read the papers you wrote at 22? So you're a very good writer and a very good student and a very good thinker. But I would hope that as I talk to you now as a not 22-year-old man, that your ideas would be more complicated and your life would be not more complicated in a bad sense, but richer and fuller. It's always sad when you meet somebody and they're intellectually dumber than when they were 22. And that's what you're looking for. Someone who went off to become, say, a former student that meets with Hope here in Houston because she happens to live here, who's literally a NASA rocket engineer. And so she's not home, reading Plato. She reads a lot, and she has to read a lot because she's trying to put people on the moon again. And then beyond that, get to Mars. And that's part of her project. So she's as intellectually interesting as when I first knew her. She's more intellectually interesting. But the quest of wonder has taken her in an infinitely different direction than an undergrad education and great texts could give you.
I'd like to focus a little on the dialogue aspect of what you just said.
The dialogue, yeah.
Yeah, because as educators and really just as people, I mean, there's this sense in which we do put these great texts in front of our students and we expect them to have this dialogue, and we might also be a party in that dialogue as well. But we're also, it's also something we're just always doing as human beings. We're
Yeah,
always dialoguing in some way. In fact, I heard you gave a great talk about this at the Redefining Classics conference last year about the cosmological canon, you called it. But there's
yeah,
some way in which that dialogue is always happening. So, what is it about dialogue that's so key to education?
yeah. So sometimes people misunderstand Socratic dialogue and are deeply disappointed in Plato's Socrates because he talks a lot. And the interlocutors just seem to say, yes, Socrates, no, Socrates, this is not clear. That's because Socrates has better ideas that he's helping his students wrestle with. And if they don't get the idea he's suggesting, they tell him so and they go in a new direction. Or if they do get the idea, he tells them so. He agrees with them. He follows what his students can comprehend. So it isn't just people think you should come into a classroom and listen to what freshmen in college have to say about the world. No, they're wrestling with a very profound dialogue, and you should be pushing them all the time to come up with better answers, better solutions, to what they're doing.
Hmm.
So you give a lecture, for example. Lectures aren't bad from a
Right.
great text point of view. Sometimes they're treated as if they're bad. That becomes another text with which someone would wrestle. So I try to say speculative things often to my faculty. That my most recent lecture in January to the faculty speculated that we're trying to guess what the world will look like for our students long after, given my age, I'm dead. Will I be around 30 years from now? Yeah, I could be. My dad's 87. And so I could make that if I live as long as my dad. But 40 years from now, my students will only be, if they're college students, like 62. I would expect most of them to still be alive given modern medicine. And what will the workforce look like, 40 years from now when I surely won't be alive statistically? No one knows. And you can tell that by going backwards, like in 40-year increments, and trying to guess how colleges should have prepared people for the workforce. Now, what I know is this: if you learn to read well, write well, think well, and be numerate, and you understand the scientific methods, then work itself could disappear. This is what no one seems to understand. If civilization lasts the way it's going, there may be fewer and fewer things for even smart people to do. The Industrial Revolution got rid of muscle power as necessity. That doesn't mean athletes stop playing games just because we don't have to. We like playing games like football, baseball. So muscle power you can still get paid for it, but not so much or as easily as you used to be able to. There are fewer muscle paid jobs. Just like if you want to be a farmer, you might be a hobbyist farmer, but we no longer need like half the population to farm like we did in 1900 to get enough to eat. I think it's 1 or 2% of the population that actively farms. But we might buy cheese that we like from our local artisan cheesemaker who just does it in one way for the joy of cheese making. So educators should begin to think about this. Every once in a while, you have a student who's like a trust fund kid. They don't have to get a job. They're never going to be required to work. If you have that kid in your class, what should they be educated? Is the only reason to be educated to get a job? If it turns out that a combination of robotics and AI end up doing most of even the menial intellectual tasks, like high-end intellectual tasks, the way I knew a guy in West Virginia as a really little boy who went from being very important in banking to having no job whatsoever because his nickname was the calculator. Like he was one of those guys who could just do instant math, add, subtract with perfect accuracy. Now, if you think about a world where the abacus was still being used, the calculator is a very valuable employee. But the minute the calculator could be done with a machine by any of the rest of us without that skill, why would you hire the calculator? once you discovered that the calculator, the mechanical one, was more accurate more often and didn't have to get paid like the calculator's mental skill went away. So what if all mental jobs go away, jobs for which people are going to pay, and we become much more like George Jetson in the old cartoon, where our jobs are like pushing a button that says keep going. This is where I point out that the old Star Trek show, the one from the 60s, probably had a more accurate console than the more recent Star Treks, including the most recent. The most recent Star Treks, they have all kinds of buttons and inputs that you have to do, whereas Kirk on his command chair basically had a knob to give percentages and a yes/no set of clicky buttons. If computer technology and robotics continue the way we think they are, and machines stay our servants, then why do I want to do many of the tasks I currently have to do? So how would I educate a kid that after my lifetime is not going to have a job for work? Well, here's really good news. It turns out that to have a fulfilling life, learning to read well, write well, think well, be numerate, and develop virtues of character, even if I were a non-Christian, that would be the way you would educate a trust fund baby who never has to work. And we know those people already exist inside of school systems. And they're actually growing in number. They're not shrinking in the United States context. But then even for everybody else, it may come to be that almost none of us can do what we do for a living and derive satisfaction out of it. Now, it won't be everyone, because I think, for example, sports show us that people like watching people do muscly things. And if you're really good at it, they'll pay you a lot of money for that. And it could be that people like people to be their teachers. The best example I know is right now, Grok could teach you Greek, ancient Greek. Right now, AI has the capacity. It's never going to be impatient. It's always going to be there. And as the interface gets better, we're going to have more and more like virtual Hayden. Father Hayden will be able to teach you anything patiently. And that side of teaching will probably stop doing. Why would we keep doing that? On the other hand, meeting Al Geyer through needing to learn Greek from him changed my life in important ways that learning Greek better via, some little future iteration of Grok could never have done. So would I have paid Al to sit and mentor me through learning Greek? Of course I would have. It's the most valuable thing in the world. It's a little bit like saying, if I could have an athletic trainer, I'm now in Lent, just started Lent today, if you're Orthodox. You guys have 2 days, right?
2 days.
2 days to party. Yeah, my last party yesterday. I'll be much lighter and much more well-balanced by Pascha. It's 48 days away, because this year it's the same for both East and West. Would that it were always the same. Anyway, that kind of discipline in working out, which I'll start today as part of a Lenten discipline, would go much better if I could afford a workout coach. And I've had them at different times. And that's always something people are going to do. I'm just going to sit on my bike by myself, and that's less cool. A virtual coach, maybe that would help me, but I don't see particularly why.
Right.
So that's a long rant to say classical education, as conceived by Plato, can never go out of style, and it would fit any civilization at any level, which is why people who were super rich, whose kids didn't have to get jobs, gave it to their kids. Because not working isn't good for us. Think of the future in the best case scenario of being a kind of Etsy economy, where I have this staff at Christmas time, we break a piñata shaped like an ass, because it's the airy ass. So on December 6th, I go out with the college students and smash a giant airy ass. And I do it soon with this staff, which is made out of holly. And symbolically, we could get into what holly is made of. Now, I assume a machine could have made that more efficiently. But instead, I went to an acquaintance on Etsy and had them craft it, because they're making it and my interacting with them gives it more value to me. And so a kind of Etsy economy, I think, will always exist, but maybe not for things we quickly need. Like once you can do 3D printing and I can live in a Victorian house with Victorian faux furniture, most of my furniture is going to come that way without ever being touched by human hands out of sheer cost and efficiency. But I bet I still keep the literal 19th century stuff I have because I like holding something that was held by someone when Victoria was on the throne. So the world will change in the most optimistic way, but my education shouldn't change if we're educating people properly. And that's why just learning job skills, everything I learned in my wonderful, it really was wonderful, Christian high school that I graduated from in 1981, every skill I learned that was practical is now useless. I know how to load a Commodore 64. It was load, quote, star, quote, comma, 8, that's the disk drive, comma, 1. And a fair number of your listeners don't even know what a disk drive is.
Right.
But so all those skills in the practical classes I had in this wonderful high school, they're useless to me. I'm even sorry I can remember how to do that. But the wisdom that I got from my mom and dad, the wisdom that I got from teachers in college, from people like Al Geyer, that never goes away.
Well, and look at what happens in communities where there is a big shift in technology, like coal mining towns in Pennsylvania, in West Virginia, Pennsylvania, where those workers had been kind of trained in this one area, and now all of a sudden it's an area that we don't really have the demand for. And so there's always a lot of talk about, well, what do we do with those communities? We have to give them job training for some other field that they can then work in that can kind of replace it, but that field will eventually go out of style as well. If they had been taught to learn, if they had been taught the liberal arts, then they would have that sort of portable skill that they could take into, they could learn a different trade maybe or something. So it does seem like this is a much more enduring vision of education.
Yeah, everything you're describing are the skills that my wonderful Christian high school, which was not classical, my dad started, but it was a traditional American school. And as a result, though, of being Christian, it actually did accidentally focus on reading a lot because we read a lot of the Bible and we read a lot of literature. And you see more and more schools getting away from reading. And as far as I can tell, there's no substitute for a certain mental building that needs to take place both in kids and young adults and adults to reading. Somebody should tell me what it is because I don't see anything that's like that. I also think in a scientific age, we should at least understand how science works because then we won't be overly afraid of something like AI, but neither will we worship it. When computers first came around, I had people that I could just show numbers on my computer and they would believe them, even though I was the one that inputted the data. Like if I told them, you have an A, they would say, no, I don't have an A. But if I turned my computer screen around and said, that's what the computer shows, there was a period of time in a group of people that they would just say, oh, okay, that's right. Anyone who understood computers would not fall for that kind of garbage. And I'm afraid as we become more intellectually ignorant about what science is, people both fall for a false expertise in science or they fall for a false skepticism about what science tells us. So they either lurch between being radically afraid we should all become Amish and the world can only be a hellscape in the future if we don't, to science will solve all our problems and we will live. Gene Roddenberry actually began to fall into this. He was so into scientism that he wouldn't show the crew of the original Enterprise or the first season of Next Generation as making certain kinds of mistakes, like using drugs. Because by then, people would have thought their way out of these kinds of problems. Relational problems, for example, they would be more mature. And I fail to see at all how having warp drive would cause people to have different sin problems than they've had for all of human history. But somehow Gene believed that. I think partly because he put a lot of faith in science that was misplaced. So again, even if science gets to the point where AI is doing the research, given the limits of science, you would still say, yeah, we don't want to know that. We don't want you to do that. We don't want thus far and no further. That would be human control. And I don't see why we couldn't build that into the system, but maybe somebody can tell me why, in which case we shouldn't do AI.
Yeah. That has to be on ready display in the place that you're endeavoring to educate in this way. I mean, I think about, Father Wes brought up the kind of the towns where the central industry becomes kind of, a thing of the past. But yeah, it seems like in Houston, where you're at, this is so every few years when I fly through Houston, I can barely recognize the city. It
Yeah,
seems
that's
like
right.
it's growing so rapidly. So you're educating in this way in a town where I can imagine, yeah, what are our students going to be doing in 30 years? Because what is Houston going to be in 30 years? So how have you found ways of kind of staying connected with the kind of the pulse of the city you're actually in, while also not assuming that city is just going to be the Houston of today for the next 30 years?
In fact, a reason this project was done in Houston, I got to a point in my life, fathers, where I could choose where to live, right? There are several places I could choose to work. I love my job. I didn't want to leave Torrey in the sense that I was tired of it, but I also had done it. And I think it's really important. I'd been there 17 years. I've been gone, amazingly, almost as long as I was there. But as the founder, I was the only employee for a year, like full-time employee. Your DNA are going to be deeply embedded in it in 100 years, unless somebody works really hard. And that's enough, right? As a founder,
Yeah.
you should move on. You should do something new. So that was part of it. It was also, though, the kind of project we're talking about, fully integrated college all the way down, K through 16. That's not a project many people should be interested in. It kind of is a new wine and needs a new wineskin. And I put it this way. Philadelphia was kind of the city in America of the 18th century. You go there and you're kind of like apex. Philadelphia was a little bit the 18th century, though the Eagles would argue that, given the Super Bowl. And then Chicago is easy to stereotype as the city of the 19th century. So you go to Chicago and you look at the buildings from the late 19th, early 20th century, and you say, yeah, that's America. That was the heartbeat of something going on in America, a changing America, sort of beginning with Lincoln, moving through like the 1950s, Detroit, a little bit like that, but less so. I think Los Angeles really was the city of the 21st or the 20th century. California Dreamin', Ronald Reagan. If it happened in California, the rest of the country would eventually get it, whatever was going on. Hollywood, making the culture. I just don't think that's true anymore. And so I tried to make a guess that Houston, which is always reinventing itself constantly, is going to be the city of the 21st century. When Houston got free of it's not free, but got more free from the shackles of historic racism and slavery, and got free from being, monomaniacally tied to oil, where, the whole city would go into a Great Depression, that boom bust cycle that was really extreme. Then if you think about it, Houston is in the middle of the United States. The weather is bad, but air conditioning means heat is always better than cold in one way to do business. So I have to wear a jacket year round in Houston because they over air condition everything. We have hurricanes. There are bad things about Houston, but we're surrounded by flat land that you can build on infinitely. And Houstonians themselves have torn their own city down and rebuilt it so many times that finding this is a little bit like LA, but without the geographic constraint of the mountains, right? Eventually, they ran out of land in Los Angeles, and that's just never going to happen in Houston. We're surrounded by infinite land. But also, Houstonians themselves are not reverent. There's not like a social class here. that you can't get into. You can work your way up. So Houstonians are very innovative. So yeah, to think these kinds of thoughts, you want to be in a place that's like that. And so I think Houston was a bet. We made a bet on the city. So our students, we try not to replicate anything the city does. So the city does almost all the major sports, not hockey, oddly enough. But we're not going to do a lot of sports teams that are semi-professional. We'll play games because that's fun to do, like intramurally or against other schools in our system. But we're not going to have semi-professional kids who either through club basketball or something, it's like they're guiding their whole life to being basketball players. We have a basketball team that's professional. We'll just go watch it. And, you know, every once in a while, you'll have 1 in a million students. My whole life, I've never had a student play pro sports. That tells you how low. And I've had opera singers. I've had low probability jobs come out of a student body. But pro sports, that's just, you know, NFL players are what? 1% of the 1%.
The headmaster at a school where I worked used to say that we would never have a football team because as soon as you bring a football team onto the campus, the culture changes dramatically, and I think that's right. Um, when you make it all about the sports, yeah, you do lose something. Um,
Yeah. So how do you teach uh, sort of lifelong fitness, a thing I've struggled with? How do you teach the pleasure of playing the game, something I enjoy? I enjoy shooting, for example, as a sport. How do you teach the kinds of things that people can do over a long period of their life without developing a kind of false professionalism? And this is,
mm,
I used to call Stola title, The Cult of the Amateur. Like being good enough at something to enjoy it. So not a hack, but not being so good at it that it consumes your life.
yeah, yeah.
I have friends who are golfers, and I never picked it up, who become maybe overly obsessed with it. Like they have to be very good. And I think maybe being pretty good would have been more healthy for them. But who knows? I'm not their priest.
I do have a hot take that golf culture is anti-Christian, but that's a whole other podcast episode.
What's interesting is golf was dying um, because, like, the generation between mine and, let's say, a 22-year-old now just didn't play golf the same
Right.
way that other generations did, partly because golf is a business game, right? You did business on the golf course. President Trump does not go out and play golf and not work. You see, he's always got a phone nearby. He's always golfing with certain people, talking about things because he's a 78-year-old man. And that's the way it went when he was a young man. That's what you did. But I've noticed that there's a kind of bro golf culture that's creeping up where it's much less, you know, Caddyshack kind of golf culture and much more the bros going out having beer and playing golf. And so that'll be interesting as golf courses and clubs transition to a much more, otherwise they die, right? They have to change. It's that it'll be cool to me. I'm sorry, you ask questions and I think about things. And so I wonder about them. I have wondered about the future of golf. Like bowling didn't recover, right?
Hmm.
Bowling was a thing. I had an uncle who was a semi-professional bowler. So there were bowling leagues. You could watch the sport on Saturdays when I was a kid. And bowling just really declined as a fun thing to do to the point that I don't know where the closest bowling alley is. And when I was a boy, that wouldn't have been true. You would have known where it was. And once a year, you would have gone bowling.
Hmm.
But when was the last time you went bowling or have you ever gone bowling?
I went bowling not that long ago. I actually feel like in our area, it's actually a kind of common thing. Though here in
Oh, is it
Maryland, we of
coming
course
back?
we also have duck pin bowling, which is sort of our unique,
Oh, where are you located?
in Maryland.
Oh, that's
Yeah,
cool.
yeah,
So my generalization is false where you live.
yeah. I think so. I think I like we took the boys, our two sons bowling not very long ago. I'm trying to remember why, but it was just a couple. Maybe we just had a free Saturday to kill, and so we
Yeah,
just went bowling. And
we had a faculty party at an alley. There are still people who bowl,
yeah,
obviously. I I'm not sure that activities. This is where I'm thinking, like going out and doing things. Hopefully, a classical education makes you do it because golf and bowling. I'm glad to hear it. If bowling survives, it's going out and doing something.
yeah, yeah.
So that would be good news. Always take good news.
Good news is most welcome.
Yeah.
Well,
I, I
speaking,
have, I have bishops that I'll present on certain things. And because they assume if the world is getting worse, that certain young adult behaviors from that they remember from kids their age are getting worse. And I always go in and tell them these are the best behaved kids from your point of view of any generation of American kids in ever. And no one will believe me. They're like, no, that can't possibly be true. Yes, their biggest problem is loneliness
right.
and suicidal ideation and things like that. They're not doing, it would be better if they were doing more bad things, he said stupidly. Don't really mean that, but because they're not going out anywhere, it's hard to get into a particular kind of trouble.
Right, right.
Just digital sins.
Yeah, sure. Which of digital consequences.
Yeah.
Or mental consequences. But they're not smoking, for example, the way my generation did.
Mm-hmm.
And that's good.
It is until they're vaping, which might actually be
Yeah, worse, as it turns out. Vaping, I tried vaping because I actually like nicotine, and vaping just seemed inherently dangerous to me after a while.
Yep.
Because of vape shops.
Yeah.
Go into a vape shop and I would say, yeah, I trust this guy to have made this stuff that I'm now going to.
He told me it was legit.
This guy is really trustworthy with nothing. Is what yeah. I became cynical.
Yeah.
well. Speaking of doing things, one thing that we like to do here at the podcast is as we end our conversation together, we like to talk about one thing that we're sort of into. It can be anything. It doesn't have to be related to our conversation at all. It can be a book, a film, an experience. So, Dr. Reynolds, what are you into? And you can't say golf, bowling, or vaping.
Yeah, no, that's very true. I've already eliminated those as possibilities in this conversation that could be said to have maundered endlessly. But I like being interested in everything, and I'm talking to two interesting people. So I think we probably could talk all day and enjoy it until. See, I'm in Lent already, so it's not like I want to eat lunch because lunch is going to be horrible. Lent eliminates every food I like. And so I'm not one of those. I don't go into Lent gladly, but it's so good for me. I say all of that to say it's so good for me, obviously. So what am I into? I think the strangest thing that I do is I get very interested in a particular topic, and then I learn way too much about it. So most recently, I was very into circuses and trying to figure out why in America circuses went from being a ubiquitous phenomena to essentially being dead, at least for Anglos. Not so much in the Latino culture here, where there are still circus that will come to town. But the circuses of Ringling Brothers, like the big phenomena, where there were multiple like circuses. Circuses lasted a long time. There are parts of the world where they still go on, but that culture died. And so I sort of hyper investigated it to try to learn why. And so I actually accidentally joined the International Circus Organization in the United States, whose members make even John Mark look young. And so the person who entered me into the database was old enough that she died within a year of my joining. And so she entered me not as John Mark, but Frank. So I have a secret circus ID, Frank Reynolds, that if there ever was a circus, I could run away and join it as Frank Reynolds. So that is the strangest thing I've gotten interested in lately.
Frank Reynolds is the dad in It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, I think.
Oh,
So that fits very well.
Right. I had not remembered that, but it is true. And thinking about circus fires, for example, a very clever thing that circuses used to do is when they were under the big top canvas tents, they needed to rainproof them. And a really smart thing to do in a culture where a third of people smoke is to rainproof them with paraffin. On the list of things you should not do, that would be one of them. And then it's interesting crowd behavior. If the big top catches on fire, if you think about it, you ought to be able to go backwards from your seat. Most men carry pocket knives, like rip it, go underneath it. What did almost everybody do when there was a circus fire?
Try to go out the door.
Yeah, they tried to go out the two entrances or the obvious entrances and exits. And so that by itself, I began to think about that kind of phenomena. How do you avoid being that person who in the middle of a crisis doesn't stop and say, look at all those people running to an exit where the lions are and blocking the entrance. I shall not climb over the lion cage to try to get out. I shall jump off my seat and go underneath the canvas tent that's burning. And very few people actually do that sort of thing.
Interesting.
Another purpose of a good education.
Yeah, that's right. It is to say, I'm on RMS Titanic and I'm not gonna, because I'm a gentleman, rush the lifeboats. How do I survive? Like Charles Herbert Lightoller, the only officer that survived. How do I maximize my chances of survival while still being a gentleman? Is something most people didn't think about or do. They did dumb things. So, and just died. Okay, there you have it. We got the Titanic and circus fires into one conversation.
Love it. Love it. Only on the Sacramentalists. Father Hayden, what are you into these days?
So we're starting to get ready to plant the spring garden in the backyard, which is one of my favorite parts of the year. Yeah, we had to go sort of visit the Day of the Lord on the English ivy in the back, which in the rainy season definitely encroaches aggressively. And so Christy and I got out there and we drove it back to its boundary, only to do battle with it assuredly in the future. But that was great, but it also always reminds me that in the intervening months, those specific muscles that I use to destroy English ivy definitely atrophy. And so I'm feeling it today. Like I'm like, wow, I'm not like that. That is, I did not use any of those muscles precisely in the time between the last time we drove back the ivy. So that's what we're into right now. And the kids are selecting what their little plot that they're assigned to plant something and to help it grow, what they're going to plant there. So it should be fun. What vegetable do you want to eat a lot of this summer? So is the question at the table these days.
Love
it. That's fantastic. Well,
so from
no, go ahead. What are you doing?
So for me, I'm into Fort McHenry. Our oldest son just turned 7 this past weekend, and we gave him, kind of, what do you want to do for your birthday? And he said he wanted to go to Fort McHenry in Baltimore, which I had never been to. So it was kind of
kid.
Right. It was fantastic. I was so happy he picked that. And we're living where we live. We're sort of near Annapolis, so we have DC and Baltimore very close, and so he wanted to take advantage of that. So we spent the day there and learned a lot. Was aware, of course, of the Battle of the Harbor and the Star Spangled Banner and all that, but was not aware of how active the fort was during the Civil War, during World War I, and all that. And so it was really cool to see. They've got a lot of great living history.
Did they bury John Wilkes Booth there for a while, or was it a different place?
I think it was maybe a different place, but I don't know for sure. They didn't mention it if they did.
They squirreled his body away when they came to identify it. I think you're right. I think it wasn't there. But
they did imprison Francis Scott Key's grandson there for a time because he lived in Baltimore and was the owner of a newspaper that was very critical of Lincoln in the run up to the Civil War. And so they shut down his newspaper and put him in jail there for a time.
Wow, that's something.
Yeah. So very interesting. Loved it. It was a great place and definitely somewhere we're going to go back again, I think.
Yeah, I'd love to learn. Now I'm full of wonder. This is again why I don't understand people who just think education is about getting answers. I think you did get a lot of answers at Fort McHenry. And I asked you a question because I wondered if it related to something else I was thinking about. And you told me no. And so we could go on to wonder about other things.
Hmm.
That kind of guided discussion is education, I think.
Yes.
Well, friends, unfortunately, our time is up today. So, listeners, thank you for joining us on this conversation. Dr. Reynolds, thank you for joining us on this podcast.
Let's do it again sometime.
We'd really like that too. And listeners, would you, please continue. Please give us a like and a subscribe on YouTube if you think to do so. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter. And as always, you can always join the communion of Patreon saints for $5 a month. Father Wes, would you give us a blessing?
Yeah, before I do, I wanted to read one of our hymns from our Anglican hymnal. It's ceremoniously called hymn number 299. But it's called Sing Praise to God Who Spoke Through Man by Percy Dermer. And the third verse is Sing Praise to God Who Spoke Through Man for Socrates, who phrase by phrase talked men to truth unshrinking, and left for Plato's mighty grace to mold our ways of thinking. For all who wrestled sane and free to win the unseen reality, to God be thanks and glory. The peace of God. Go ahead, Doctor.
No, it's a great hymn. Yay for them.
The peace of God, which passeth all understanding, keep your hearts and minds in the knowledge and love of God and of his Son, Jesus Christ our Lord. And the blessing of God Almighty, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost be with you this day and always. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Reverend Fathers. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Dr. Reynolds.